Ladies and gentlemen, may we begin, please? The title of this luncheon panel is it all falling apart, or has the Transatlantic Law Forum just gone nuts? In the old days of the Transatlantic Law Forum, we used to have a guessing contest who had named this particular panel. Was it Michael Grieva or Michael Zeller? And it was always easy to make that choice. It would be if Michael was here, but this is clearly a Grievian title. I'm going to introduce our three panels, and then I'm going to say a few words to introduce the subject of our conversation. Our three panelists, in the order in which they will speak from the far side coming towards me, are Martin Klingst, who is a senior expert at Atlantik, Brücke in Berlin. He's been a fellow at the German Marshall Fund, at the Harvard Center for European Studies. His reporting for Die Zeit, which continues to this very day, and other papers, has won the George F. Kennan Editorial Prize and the German Reporter Prize. But his main reason for being here at this conference is that he has recently published a book that actually has the word transatlantic in the title. So we thought that he had to be here. The book is Guido Goldman, Transatlantic Bridge Builder, published in 2021. Nazak Nikakhtar is a partner at Wiley Rein here in Washington, where she advises, audits, and where necessary litigates on matters of international trade and national security. In the Trump administration, she was Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration, and Undersecretary of Commerce for Industry and Security. And when announcing former members of the Trump administration, I should say she was not acting. She actually was confirmed by the Senate for her initial position, and in fact confirmed unanimously. Nazak is a senior fellow at the Center for Technology Diplomacy at Purdue University. Anna Swanson reports excellently on trade and international economics for the New York Times, as she did previously for the Washington Post. When she was even younger than she is today, she lived in China for 8 years, where she was an editor of Foreign Policy's South Asia Channel and editor-in-chief of the China Economic Review magazine in Shanghai. One of the most remarkable things about contemporary politics is that most of the highly contentious, divisive policy issues that we're facing today turn out to be arguments about jurisdiction, or in Europe, competence. So when people talk about immigration, or green versus fossil fuel energy, or abortion, freedom of speech and religion, crime and civil behavior, trans sports, they seem to be arguing about who gets to decide. Does the national government decide, or does the state decide, or does the locality decide? Why did everybody suddenly become so passionate about what were previously fairly arcane and subsidiary matters? It has always been the case, of course, that there's always been something of a partisan or philosophical valence here. Progressives and liberals are centralizers, and conservatives and Republicans and libertarians are decentralizers. And you can see that traditional breakdown at work, for example, in the arguments over abortion in the United States and many arguments over economic policy in Europe. But I think that the current situation has changed for three reasons that I'll mention briefly. The first is that we are dealing with a new set of policies that are highly consequential and new and surprising. The idea that we would have essentially open borders, This was not part of our politics any time until recently. That government should essentially be saying that we are going to abolish the internal combustion engine automobile and forbid natural gas stoves. This is not like old-fashioned water and pollution control politics. That young men who say that they feel that they are a man in a woman in a man's body should be able to compete on women's sports teams. These are, and many new identity and gender conflicts, these are new forms of policy debate. When one side seizes the center, the other side interposes state, local, or in Europe, national power to do everything in their everything possible to defeat, frustrate, if necessary, sabotage what the dastardly centralized forces are doing. So jurisdiction is just become a weapon in for fighting out issues that are that a lot of people think are tending toward being existential. The second is we have this new class cultural divide in our politics, which is especially new to Americans. We haven't seen it before. It changes traditional partisan and political divisions, centralizing institutions, the federal government in America, the institutions of the EU in Europe, are largely in the control of and are supported by highly educated, articulate, relatively affluent, mobile individuals, David Goodhart's anywheres. They tend to be secular, neoliberal in either progressive or libertarian strains. They tend to have weak attachments to the nation and to locality. Local governments, local politics is more in the hands of and supported by lesser educated, working class, lower middle class people compared. They are David's somewheres. They are relatively religious, conservative, traditionalist. They are attached to locality, and they are intent on preserving local autonomy and particularity. This is scrambled a lot of conservative versus liberal positions. For example, the newly conservative, the new working class Republican Party in the United States is much more comfortable to big government, centralized government that devotes itself to the welfare of working class people and is less attached to traditional ideas that smart, elite, highly educated people like myself have always believed in, such as free trade. Finally, there is an obvious democratic politics divide. Central governments are always, to one degree or another, less small d democratic than local governments, but there's been a striking decline in democracy just in the simple old-fashioned sense of representative lawmaking, which is associated with this divide between centralized and localized power. This is particularly conspicuous in Europe, of course, where the national governments are democratically elected, the local legislatures are, but most of the laws that come down from Brussels, Strasbourg, are the work of courts and bureaucracies. It's a little different in the United States because our chief of staff and the head of the central government is himself popularly elected, but more and more the actual laws in Washington are not made by the Congress, but made by the bureaucracies, to some extent by courts, but most of all by the emerging, growing administrative state or executive state. As a result, our law has become in recent years highly partisan. The president is no longer the national leader. He's working for his party, and he's expected to enact laws on many of the matters that I have just mentioned, precisely to excuse his congressional co-partisans from the necessity of taking an uncomfortable vote. And our president has become a very, very deeply divisive figure, I would say, since the middle of the Clinton administration. But our laws, increasingly from the federal government, are very weak on the traditional ideas of social depth that comes from representative, consensus-based lawmaking. Can we, in this new and unsettled era, reconstitute some sort of politics that recognizes the relative strengths and the relative limits of centralized versus local government? Our distinguished panelists are now about to answer that question, beginning with Martin.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Scalia Law School, for having me here. It's a great honor. And I also had the honor, while I was based in Washington between 2007 and 2014, to meet Justice Scalia a couple of times. So most of my life I've been a journalist, and journalists, everyone knows, know almost nothing about anything and always have a strong opinion. But I also have a legal background. So when my editors-in-chief, when I was a senior political editor back in Germany, got on my nerves, I always told them, if you continue bothering me, I go back to my real profession. So let me start with a hypothesis. If Alexander Hamilton were alive today, and if he were a European, I would venture to say that he would probably be a strong advocate of a strong European Union. I would even go so far to say that in the ideological dispute over whether the EU is more of an alliance of nation states in the sense of modern national conservatism, or rather an independent union in the sense of a left liberal interpretation, Hamilton would tend to lean towards the latter, which means that he would very well be a proponent of a sovereign European federal state. Why? While modern national conservatism emphasizes decentralization, such as reduced federal oversight and increased local control, especially with regard to economic, social, and cultural policies, Hamilton campaigned for the formation of a strong, centralized federal government. He believed that a weak central government that merely acted as an intermediary would be ineffective, imbecilic, because it couldn't directly address the needs of the people. So what does it mean for today? Hamilton's arguments are still relevant as they highlight the ongoing balancing act between central authority and regional autonomy, a debate and often a heavy political fight carried out around the world and within nations, including in discussions about international governance structures like the European Union. The ideological dispute has become even more relevant with the recent elections to the European Parliament. Both moderate conservatives and nationalist far-right parties have emerged victorious from these elections. The election results will not be without consequences for the further development of the EU. It is difficult to make any predictions, but I'm sure that after times of Brussels overreach and the Brexit shock, a kind of new realism will take hold in the EU, a new balancing act. This can be seen in the constant balancing and new equilibrium between the new need for national autonomy and the requirement for tight cooperation and binding European rules. But what does that mean for the future of the EU? In my opinion, there will only be small, gradual, but not dramatic changes. Why? Because even a number of nationalist far-right parties, which yesterday would have preferred to turn their backs on the EU, have softened their criticism and have started to recognize the special value of the EU. So a new realism and pragmatism will probably return to the EU. In principle, experience show that even the EU's biggest critics, such as Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, are very well aware of the benefits of the EU. No doubt the EU will change. Brussels' central power will be curtailed in favor of national sovereignty, but not dramatically, as the victory of Eurosceptics and Eurosceptics parties might suggest. I would briefly mention 5 examples that lead me to this assumption. First, the Brexit shock. Contrary to all expectations, Brexit has not led to the disintegration of the EU, but on the contrary, to its strengthening. Even right-wing populist and right-wing nationalist politicians in France, Hungary, Poland, and Italy are not thinking of leaving the EU any longer. Moreover, the list of countries that would like to join the EU is getting longer and longer. Today, around 60% of Britons say that leaving the EU was a major mistake. The turnaround is probably partly due to the fact that many of the 52% of voters who voted to leave the EU almost 8 years ago are no longer alive. Remember, the Brexit vote was also one of the old against the young. On the other hand, 8 years of legal uncertainty and 3 years without access to the European single market, Brexit was de facto completed on January 1st, 2021. All this has clearly shown the British what the price is for gaining political sovereignty, or rather, what this price is beginning to be. Because Brexit is not an event, it's a process. Supply chains are gradually breaking because it is no longer worthwhile for small and medium-sized companies from the EU, in particular, to trade with the island due to the bureaucratic burden. As a result, products are gradually becoming more expensive or more difficult to obtain, including medicines. British farmers are gradually realizing that their main sales area, the continent, is becoming increasingly difficult to access. The exports to the EU countries have already fallen by over 25% since 2019, as the British Farmers' Union recently reported. And it's gradually becoming also clear that the free trade agreements promised by Brexit supporters with countries such as Australia and New Zealand or the United States will not be able to compensate in the slightest the loss of 500 million consumers in Europe. And it has also long been abundantly clear that Brexit has in no way limited immigration, as many Britons had hoped. On the contrary, the influx of people to the island has increased to the record net figures of 764,000 immigrants in 2022 and 685,000 immigrants in 2023. At this point, I would also briefly make another prediction. The UK is voting, and the next government will in all likelihood be led by the more EU-friendly Labour Party. It will not lead the UK back into the EU, at least not for the time being, but Great Britain will once again seek closer ties with the EU and Brussels, especially on issues such as trade, security, and migration policy. Second point I would like to make is the refugee shock. There's a paradox to observe. Hardly any other crisis like the migration crisis has driven the EU member states politically apart, and at the same time has brought them together again, out of pure necessity. The EU's new asylum compromise that has just been agreed is an example of new realism, of thinking together European regulatory inevitabilities and national idiosyncrasies. I don't want to go into the details, but here are a couple of points. For the first time, there will be asylum procedures to prevent migrants with little chance of being accepted from continuing their journey. Migrants are to be detained near the border and deported directly from there. Legally, they are considered not to have entered the EU. Migrants who are classified as a security threat or who have misled the authorities, for example, with a false passport, are also subject to border procedures. The third point is the war shock. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has brutally demonstrated us Europeans two things. Firstly, that war in Europe has once again become a possibility, and that Russian imperialism remains a major threat. Secondly, that we Europeans, and especially we Germans, as the largest economic power, have extremely neglected our defense capabilities for decades and have become convenient free riders for American security guarantees. But since then, almost all EU member states have invested significantly more money in their defense and will continue to increase their arms spending. A fourth issue, the trade shock, or China. The US's tough stance toward China and the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act, which promotes American protectionism and leads to distortion of competition with Europe, has in turn brought the EU closer together economically. The IRA is seen as a threat for EU's technological future since it redirects investments from the EU to the US. For the United States, China represents the greatest challenge to US national security and economic interests. China is perceived as a threat to the global order. And I think Europe is stepping up to the plate and sees now also China as a systemic rival and will also take consequences. You can also see that in the debate of bringing back some of major industries when it comes to the chip industry or the pharmaceutical industry. And also you will see the discussion where they talk not about decoupling, but de-risking. Nevertheless, Europe is heavily dependent on the Chinese market, and you see a rift also inside the EU between countries that heavily depend also on Chinese investment and others that depend lesser on it. The fifth point I would make, and then I come to my conclusion, is the high-tech shock. We have not yet in Europe met the chances of digitalization, and I'm talking also about artificial intelligence and what that means for our future markets and the German economy and the European economy. So I think we need a lot of cooperation also with the United States on this issue. And I think that the transatlantic relations, despite all the turbulences and maybe also despite the outcome of the November election in the United States, will remain a pillar. And there is no way to go around it. Even though you will probably see more European independence on some issues, but as I pointed out, this is long overdue, like more investment in our military capacities. So to come to my conclusion, the time for a new realism in the EU was overdue, and you will see that there is going to be a shift back to individual member states when it comes to day-to-day issues. I think this is also necessary. In our discussion this morning, we had also the debate about creating more EU federal bodies like regional courts or also regional administrations to bring the EU also closer to the people. I think this is also very necessary. But at the same time, however, the crisis just demonstrate that the cohesion of the EU remains the goal of almost all parties across ideological boundaries, if not out of love, then at least out of realism and pragmatism. The European example could also hold lessons for the United States, where there has always been a tension between the interests of the individual states and the federal government. Here too, the dispute could take on new relevance with the possible election of Donald Trump. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you, Martin. Nazak, please.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about whether international institutions actually are still viable. And to answer that question, I think one needs to observe that these rifts potentially in the global ecosystem, trading ecosystem, the root cause is China. The fracture in the international trading, global trading system has been caused by China. So to answer the question of are international institutions still viable, one needs to look at two sub-questions. Can China participate in the global trading system? And why can't we just focus on strategic competition? We hear that word a lot. So I want to start with an economic principle. And you all know this, but I get this question a lot. The comparative advantage model, the premise there was that there's a free market system that decides who does what, which country does what. China is fundamentally a non-market economy. The government controls land, labor, electricity prices, raw material prices, so on and so forth. So when you introduce a non-market economy into a market-based system, it disrupts the equilibrium. The non-market economy is able to pull the market forces in its direction. And that's the problem we are seeing over and over again. The global trading system needs to understand that if we are committed to the market-based system, if we are committed to capitalism, then we've got to take these distorted forces out. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, part of its accession protocol was that it was going to transform to a market economy. China sort of slow-walked that process. But during that time, and this is when I was in the government, we witnessed the collapse of industries, one industry after another. Nobody said anything because China went after the commodity sector first. And so companies, if you think about the industries as a triangle, it's the commodity sectors that are on the bottom that fund the next-gen tech development and the next one and the next one. So China goes after the commodities, companies go to the next rung. China goes after that next set of technological developments. And now we're finding that companies are at the very top point of the triangle where they've ceded way too much and they're trying to cling on to what they have left. But guess what? Who controls the global revenue share from that sector? They've got the commodities, they've got every single layer of the pyramid. And so China is able to leverage its the revenue stream that it's captured to decimate industry. And we've been seeing this one after another. I think semiconductors is the most recent example where the Chinese are, they've engaged in overcapacity on the sort of mature legacy nodes. That's 95% of the global semiconductor market is the commodity stuff, the more of the legacy nodes. And so if China captures that revenue stream as it is doing so right now, where are companies going to have the capital flows to invest in their next-gen technologies in the leading edge semiconductors? China was also leveraging its developing country status, right? So we couldn't really take action. We couldn't force it really to adhere to the rules of the trading organization. We kept looking the other way. In 2004. China was telling the U.S. government, look, I'm going to reform. Here's bubbles of capitalism. We were in the government. China was submitting, thousands of pages of documents to us. That was going on until about 2007. We didn't hear anything. In 2008, 2009, we have the financial crisis. If there were any reformists in the Chinese government, they looked at the Western model, the market economy model, and they said, no, this isn't good for me. So we saw China move the other direction. We're in the trade bar, and we're all expecting China to somehow reform, but they don't, right? Well, not everybody. Some of us had our skepticism, but generally people were looking for China reform. They stop and say, nothing's changing. In fact, the pendulum has swung the other way. Then enter President Xi, great nationalist, doubles down on the China non-market economy system to further bend and distort the economy to outcompete the rest of the world. China has used its economic might and is continuing to use its economic might to influence international organizations. countries are silenced because of, as Martin alluded to, the enormous economic dependence on China, the intertwining of our supply chains, right? Because we ceded so much of the supply chains, as I talked about earlier, to China. The economic dependence has silenced countries in speaking out. The size and scale of China's economy has created situations where companies can't speak. International organizations are now unwilling to respond. In 2017, we visited, as a group of trade lawyers, and we visited the WTO to talk about China's market economy status. And we met with various countries, and we met with WTO heads. And they told us the day that we have to choose between the US and China in the WTO, that is the day that the WTO collapses. We cannot choose between our largest two members. Well, what does that tell us? The WTO, as our other international institutions, completely unwilling to discipline a member who is not playing by the rules. We see that with the WHO, with COVID, right? The COVID traces. We see that in international standards organizations. Relevant right now is doping, right? Nobody is, again, the US is speaking out, but these institutions are not willing to discipline China. We've had overcapacity. I talked about this earlier. Global Steel Forum. Countries tried to discipline China's overcapacity in steel. China said no. So here we are. We were unable to discipline China. China can say, and China's going to say, and it does say, look, this isn't my sovereign right. I can do whatever I want. That's fine. But that doesn't mean that international organizations, countries now have to deal with China, have to trade with China. And that's what we're seeing now, a pattern of countries engaging in self-help. Their economies have been so distorted. They have lost too many jobs. They've lost too many manufacturing sectors, too many high-tech capabilities. And there is this, we're kind of going through this period of growing pains. We don't know what to do with international organizations. They're not stepping up to the challenge. So countries are engaging in self-help. The United States, we have the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, really to emphasize self-help because the international institutions have just kind of stepped away from addressing this crisis. Europe is doing the same thing. I think we have about 12-ish countries doing something similar with respect to the CHIPS Act. Now we've created a condition where we're competing so fiercely against one another where we need to really start integrating our supply chains to be able to back away from China. I think there's a lot of debate about whether countries want to still stay in the global trading ecosystem. There's a lot, I hear this polarity of terms, and I think these are both wrong terms. It's either protectionists or globalists. I think most people fall into the center. They believe in the global trading system. They believe in free and fair trade, but they don't believe that the cheaters need to be part of that trading ecosystem for those reasons I talked about, the distortions that they introduce into the ecosystem. I think that in the United States, there's this sort of debate as well about, how much do we want to decouple? Do we want to strategically sort of disentangle? Do we want to fully decouple? And I want to emphasize this, and I say this as an economist. When I was at the Commerce Department, we did an analysis of the economic cost of full decoupling. Let's just say, what do we do if we totally move away from China? The impact on our GDP in the short term was about 1.5%. We looked at Europe, it was slightly higher, about 5%. But after that period, if we integrate our supply chains, we do far better on GDP growth, both the United States and Europe, meaning maintaining the status quo of trading with a distorted economy is hindering and hampering our growth, rather than if we really combine the market forces together, market economies, and develop a good global trading ecosystem. This thing about all of the import restrictions, export controls, capital flows restrictions, data restrictions, all of that is really a reaction, again, and I want to emphasize self-help in countries not knowing what to do about China. But maybe we should be considering a different way of looking at things, calling China for what it is, moving away from China, and again, trying to better integrate one another. It starts with countries working towards the goal. It starts with countries talking about this goal, and it then it's incumbent on the international institutions to really develop the might, the will, the courage, the power, et cetera, and demand by their members to start addressing the China problem and moving everybody away from that distorted actor. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazak. Anna, the podium's yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invitation. And I also share Martin's observation that journalists really know nothing, but yet can write thousands of words about it. So it's amazing, right? And here to, hopefully share some observations with you today. So I have been a trade reporter for, nearly a decade now. And I have really seen in my own work how this tension between global and centralized institutions on the one hand and more local sources of power on the other has played out. And so I thought I would talk just a bit about that paradigm, but then also some of my own experience of my own reporting. And of course, with trade, that friction is not between the level of the local and the national, as I think it is with some of the issues that Christopher mentioned, but more between the local and the national and the international. One of the strongest trends really that we've seen has been this increasing skepticism of institutions like the World Trade Organization, of free trade agreements, a backlash to, traditional, quote unquote, free trade ideology. These strands of skepticism obviously have been around for a long time on the right and the left, but I think they are gaining political momentum and starting to create a new consensus that is changing trade policy as we know it. So if you picture, traditional trade policy beliefs as kind of a bell curve with, free support for free trade in the middle, in the Bush administrations, in the Clinton administration, in the Obama administration, that was sort of the consensus, of course. And then on the left, there was always resistance. Where concerns typically centered more around whether these, superseding structures could prevent democratically elected governments from taking action to protect the environment, to protect consumers, to protect workers. And on the right, I think, the criticisms were different, that the concerns centered more around institutions compromising perhaps individual freedom, the democratic process, sovereignty. But still, there was a certain similarity of criticisms on the right and the left. And now you've seen that bell curve kind of flatten. And even like this new area of consensus between the right and the left joining together, I'm not sure what kind of shape that creates, but maybe a three-dimensional one. If someone can draw that or has an idea, I'd be interested. And you do see these kind of surprising political comings together now. I think they're sort of the exception, but some recent ones I thought were very interesting were when, for example, Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts and Josh Hawley from Missouri, they introduced an amendment to the FAA reauthorization last month that consumers should be able to get refunds from airlines if their planes are canceled. Or, in my time covering the renegotiation of NAFTA, of the North American Free Trade Agreement, I personally saw some of these interesting alliances. For example, between Robert Lighthizer, who was the USTR, and Catherine Tai, who at the time was the General Counsel of House Ways and Means, but of course today is also USTR. And so those two, built a very interesting alliance, which my colleague in the opinion section wrote about in an interesting article, where she said that their unlikely friendship played a role in bringing about a reversal of U.S. support for the international trading system. I'm sorry. That article, I'm so sorry. That article was actually about Robert Lighthizer and Lori Wallach of Public Citizen, which I think, was also a very, very interesting and actually quite influential alliance in Washington. So in trade, these kind of broader shifts, this, backlash towards a free trade ideology is, of course, motivated by some bigger trends that, Nazak and others have touched on, deindustrialization in the United States, the rise of China, increasing income inequality, increasing partisanship. I think it's worth asking if some of these trends are more linked with other factors like the rise of automation, perhaps tax practices, the provision of social services, other things beyond trade, and whether trade has kind of become a scapegoat for some of these trends. But regardless, they have redounded and impacted trade thinking and trade policy nonetheless. What practical changes did these new kinds of alliances bring about? For USMCA specifically, this kind of alliance between the right and the left resulted in an agreement that largely raised barriers to trade rather than lowered them. It rolled back investor-state dispute settlement. Both sides were very critical of investor-state dispute settlement for giving tribunals too much power over local people, over governments. It raised domestic content for automakers. It forced companies to take some actions that were deemed to improve labor standards in Mexico. And it also resulted in a clause to revisit the deal every 6 years and a sunset clause for the entire deal after 16 years. So therefore, we are set for another renegotiation, another revisiting of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement next year, which should be very interesting. There are similar trends in other institutions. In the World Trade Organization, for example, the actors I was talking about earlier, Lighthizer, Tai, Lori Wallach, most of them were critical of the actions of the appellate body at the World Trade Organization. The Trump administration, of course, froze that through approvals, and the Biden administration, has paid more lip service to the WTO. I think, talking about the importance of it, but they've also sort of continued in that same policy direction. With tariffs too. The Biden administration has given the Trump administration's China tariffs their stamp of approval by maintaining those tariffs and even increasing others. Where there is a broader consensus today, I think, it's more about restraining trade rather than promoting it. So, for example, the United States working with the EU and Japan on export controls, the United States discussing with the European Union tariffs that would be issued on electric vehicles. I want to add a caveat that there's still, of course, a lot of tension and fragility in this kind of political consensus. For USMCA, for example, congressional Democrats kind of agonized about whether or not to support the deal, even though it contained a lot of things that they did support, because it would be a political score for the Trump administration. And there was definitely a desire to make USMCA kind of a model trade deal for other trade deals. Today, that hasn't happened. There haven't been other deals of that nature accomplished. The Biden administration has tried to advance trade talks with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but there the trade pillar has been the only pillar that has not moved forward. And of course, this backlash to trade isn't universal. In Asia, for example, there's still much more momentum toward broader trade deals. But I think this is a powerful trend, and it's also playing out in other spheres that I'm less familiar with: antitrust, immigration, digital tax. So the prompt for this panel asked us to think about whether localized arrangements provide hope for a more responsive and responsible politics. So as a journalist, I try not to make normative judgments like that. But I would say I do think there is, hope for some. And the proof of that is that USMCA passed Congress by quite a wide margin. And the United States is cooperating with its allies more than ever before on things like cracking down more on China and restraining trade with China. For others, I think this shift results in less hope, a concern about paralysis, a concern about more divisions, more trade conflict, and a loss of welfare. And, I don't really want to weigh in on which is winning there, but, maybe the trend, the tide is toward people who have more hope toward this arrangement. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, I have some sharp, probing questions for each of you. But first, I want to go back to Martin and see if any of you have things to say, reflecting what the others have said, or posing questions to them. Martin, please.
Yes, leading back to what I said about, the crisis in Europe, I have the impression that overall what you can see and have been seen for the last, let's say, 15, 20 years is that more and more countries try to buy themselves out of crisis. And the crises have multiplied. So when I just look back when I came to the United States as a foreign correspondent in 2007, there was the financial crisis emerging, the housing crisis emerging. Once Obama got into office, there was a question, bailout of the auto industry. There was the question of this enormous infrastructure plan with hundreds of billions of dollars. Then you had the financial crisis was followed by the euro crisis in Europe. And the question was about, unifying the debts and the question of how do we actually buy ourselves out of this crisis. Then we had the pandemic. And there was also the question, how do you buy yourself out of this crisis in keeping workforces in place, but continue to pay the loans, and then we have now wars, which are a heavy burden also on the budgets, but also the question is how do we buy ourselves out of this crisis? So when I put this together, what I can observe since, let's say, 2007, there is more an effort to restrain trade than supporting it. And there is a lesser will to liberalize and a larger will to state and government interventions. And there is more protectionism than globalism. And I think this is a trend that you can see. And regardless who governs, you have it on the left, in the center, on the right. And even though they might ideologically dispute and quarrel, but at the end of the day, they're always willing to put money on the table to get somehow out of the crisis and keep the people calm and avoid riots. And you can see this especially in the German debate now about the military budgets. We have this extra budget, and Germany has this debt brake. I'm not going to go into this detail, but the debt brake means, you have to have a balanced budget, and you can only have a certain amount of debt. So when Ukraine was attacked by Russia, Germany rightly saw that they had not done enough to actually build up their military capacities, and then they had this $100 billion military budget, and now after 2 years of war, we see this money is not enough. We need even more. So the question is, where do you take the money from? And then you have this dispute about, well, when you invest like in military or other things, and you want to have a balanced budget, you cut then social deeds given by the government. And then you have the other side saying, well, when you do that, you will have riots in the streets and you don't win anything. So it's a constant debate, but I just wanted to point out that we have this bailout policy at the moment.
Very fine. Nazak?
I can add a few more points. So Martin talked about sort of, can we buy ourselves out of the crisis? Let's talk about what the crisis is. The crisis, at least in my view, in all the decades that I've done this, the loss of jobs in manufacturing, our technical capabilities. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute found that of the 44 emerging technologies, China had beaten the United States in 37 out of them, a majority of them with monopoly capabilities. And then the overall economic impact. When we look at the question of can countries buy themselves out of this crisis, it's important to realize we're trying to deal with China heavily subsidizing its industries. And how do we incentivize reshoring? Do we use carrot or stick approach? We're trying to use the carrot approach, but China, second largest GDP in the world, one of the lowest per capita GNIs in the world, gross national income, which tells us that the government doesn't, the workers don't make any money, the companies aren't making money, it's the government that's making money of everything we purchase from them. And so they have way more money to subsidize the heck out of industries than we ever would. So we really need to think strategically about, are we just going to be in this endless race of subsidization? It's a philosophical question, given the reality of China's economic power. Are we ultimately going to just subsidize ourselves into poverty, or are we going to try to use a blend of the carrot and the sticks approach? Carrot, catalyze, incentivize investments in the U.S. and allied markets, but also shield yourself from predatory import competition. Anna mentioned automation, AI, that's what's forming the root cause of these global trade tensions. Those always are going to be issues, but I also want to say that doesn't detract from the fundamental giant elephant in the room, which is China's distortive practices. Even if we get rid of the China issue, we're still going to have issues that will transform the global economy, redefine trade. But I think it's better to have manageable issues than, like I said, the unmanageable China issue. And one thing I wanted to underscore, because it's really important to understand these distortions in what we're dealing with and our relationship with our allies is autos and China's EV growth, right? President Trump says, I'm going to put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. Does that impact us at all? Well, China's overcapacity in EVs has really hurt the European, the Japanese, and the South Korean market. China's flooding their markets such that those OEMs in those markets can't sell at home. They can't sell at third country markets. So where are they exporting all their cars to? To the United States, where China has pretty much abandoned because its overcapacity is distorting markets. And so is this causing a tension with our allies? Absolutely. But again, going back to the main thesis, the root cause is China. Same thing we did with steel and aluminum. It was the same overcapacity dynamic that made us put in safeguards, tariffs around global imports, but it really wasn't targeted at our allies. It was the fact that our allies were shipping their excess capacity to the United States because they were losing markets. And so we've got to collectively deal with this problem. And then the final point I want to make is about, USMCA. Let's also not forget about the way that China is distorting USMCA with its growth in the Mexican market through direct investment, circumvention, and it's gotten so bad that Mexico has suppressed trade data, so we can't fully detect all the ways that China is using and abusing Mexico to circumvent and get products into the United States and Canada to displace our markets. So, I mean, I still maintain that the core issue really is China, and once we recognize it, I think then we can start solving these problems. But by pretending that the problem is a global problem and calling it protectionist versus globalist and not really addressing what the root cause is, we're never going to make any progress.
Thank you. Anna, do you?
Sure. Yeah. So I kind of want to respond along the same vein because I think Nazak and I have kind of a similar, focus and as well. So, this question of countries buying, you're talking about this question of countries buying themselves out of the crisis. I think it's a really interesting question. The United States and other countries are spending, but meanwhile, China continues to spend even more. And in the last few years, of course, China's economy has been a bit shaky. And so authorities there are really even doubling down on the export sector. And China's merchandise exports as a share of GDP in the last few years have gone up. So this problem is really kind of larger than ever before, despite the pushback. So I think that, raises questions about how much the U.S. response or other countries' response will actually change that situation. Nazak was talking about a, kind of a market system that can cut out China or a WTO that can choose. And, I feel like that could certainly help to address the issue. Would it, would it be able to change China's behavior? I mean, perhaps. Maybe not. I think China has a lot of reasons for its actions beyond the impulses of the United States, right? And you're definitely seeing this issue crop up with the issue of overcapacity in third countries. And I think it just underscores how serious this problem is for the United States, that we can build walls around ourselves, allies, around ourselves and our allies, but still when you get to the question of competing in other markets in Africa and Asia, markets that are really important for the success of American companies globally, it's just a different equation, right? So I guess I just wanted to underscore that I think, changes in U.S. behavior and changes in the trading system can help, but it'll still be a fundamental problem because of the actions of China.
And I would also add that probably China's never going to change its behavior, and that's okay, right? It can choose to do that. We can just choose to not expose ourselves to the problems that it's causing.
I mainly agree, but I differ on one point. I mean, when you look, when the IRA was released, and this was not discussed with European partners. So you just saw what happened. And it took a lot of efforts by United States governors to intervene in Washington and say, hello, Mr. President and Trade Secretary and whoever. We have a lot of German and European companies investing in our states, and VW, BMW, Mercedes, whatever. And if you make it so difficult for them, then it will have repercussions, and it's going to be bad for our states too. So then the Tech Trade Council emerged, and they were able to actually negotiate some of the things that then were taken out of the IRA. And the EV thing is also more difficult or more complex than it sometimes looks, because some of the cars that China is flooding now the European market with that were also partly produced by European manufacturers. So it's double-minded.
And just to underscore, though, that this is part of the countries engaging in self-help with the IRA, and that's the unescapable consequences of China just sort of distorting all of our markets, but nobody willing to say China's the problem. We act like China's not the problem. We try to engage in self-help, and we end up fighting with each other's nations rather than just getting together and really addressing the root problem.
Martin, you pointed out that with the rise of the national conservative parties and figures at the national level, that there has been moderation in the policies of Brussels, and there seems to be a kind of a new consensus is emerging. My understanding is that sometime in the next year or two, a question will come before some set of authorities to move from the current requirement of unanimity among the national nations to one of majority or supermajority or something like that. I've looked at that a little bit, and that will abolish the nations. I mean, that will move beyond the United States. We have a Senate with equal representation, and every senator has a hold on national legislation. If you become a majority, that will have an effect on the survival of the nation state as we've known it. And so I'm just wondering if this new spirit of amity is going to continue. What's your prognosis?
Well, it's that there's a new friendship. I doubt that, but I would say it's not going that far. I don't see a change from the unanimity rule to the majority, qualified majority rule. Why? Because it's going to bother the smaller countries, because then they will lose their veto power. And as far as I am informed, and you might correct me if there's some European lawyers here, but to go from the one rule to the other, you need, in many instances, unanimity. So to change that is almost impossible. That is, when you talk about changing the electoral system in the United States, because it has led to the tyranny of the minority. It is very difficult because you need to change the constitution. You need 2/3 of Congress and then 3/4 of the states to go along, and which that is probably impossible because the party that is going to lose in that is going to veto it. So, and you probably see the same in Europe. What you can, to come back to your question, what you see is, and what I try to point out, that the victory of the conservative forces and even the right-wing, the far right-wing forces in Europe, it is not a homogeneous bunch. There are a lot of differences on crucial issues like on Ukraine, on questions like migration, on many issues. So you can form different coalitions, and what I want to say is that the path forward is there, because it's not going to be a right-wing and conservative majority that's going to block EU progress.
Thank you very much. We have just 10 minutes to go. So despite this long list of fascinating questions, I'm going to turn things over to the audience and see if anyone has questions. If you do, if you could please proceed to one of the microphones at either side of the room. And I think we're all getting to know each other, but it would not be nice if you introduced yourself before posing your question. Yes, sir.
Federal government. I wonder if you've been following the recent news over the last couple of weeks regarding an issue such as Belt and Road initiatives by China. And one in particular was regarding Zambia. Zambia had been approached by the Chinese government that they had failed to pay what is required for all the infrastructure they built in their country, and they were running in the red. They couldn't pay them. They didn't know what to do. They finally reached the government here. And Secretary of State Blinken presented them with a check or with additional funds to cover the bill. So that's how Belt and Road operates. They expect payment for what is done. Somehow, I remember a Secretary of State indicating you have to read the fine print in dealing with China, because you're going to have to pay in the end, and they're trying not to tell you too much about that in the beginning. So you wonder about trade and how it works, and they had to have greater exports to China to pay the bill, and they couldn't come up with anything. I guess they basically were supplying raw materials, metals and whatnot. Okay. And the rest of the things apparently weren't to their taste. So basically, I wondered, do you figure, is there anything about this like equal trade or new rules that are required in dealing so countries don't become bankrupt and have to run to a third party to pay the bill?
That's right. And I'm really glad you asked this question. And I'm going to provide a spoiler alert, because my colleague and I were going to just write an article about this, because we're so frustrated with this problem. And those checks go right to China, right? So we're just transferring money to China. So some of these Belt and Road contracts are in line, and if you quickly look at them, you'll see that basically China does this big project, and if you don't pay them, they can take any asset in your country, and if you don't like that, they will try you in Chinese courts under Chinese law. Okay, but what if? So my partner and I have been consulting with a few countries on this. What if we just re-envisioned our response to Belt and Road such that we help countries institute national security laws like CFIUS, where the Chinese say, I'm going to take any asset, and you say, no. I'm going to reduce the value of the investment from all the environmental harm and all the other harms you've caused. And you can't take any asset because I have national security laws, and you can't take X, Y, and Z because it's critical to national security. So you can have this little sandcastle on the beach, but that is all you can have. The Chinese will say, well, no, I don't like that. I'm going to try you in Chinese courts under Chinese laws. No, that was fraudulent inducement. Those provisions of the contract are null and void. We're going to go to international arbitration, and we are going to try this. The international arbitration venue is still a venue where it has not been tainted by China's influence. And so for just mere litigation costs, every country can get of Belt and Road. So the U.S. policy should be to support these litigation costs to help countries get themselves out of the Belt and Road, about $3 million per country, rather than signing these big whopping checks where it just goes straight into the CCP's pockets and then into the PLA.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Great. I'm a professor, Abe Newman from Georgetown. And my question is, where do you see a positive economic agenda for the transatlantic community? Because I think the standard story that every ambassador here in Washington would tell us is it's about the liberal rules-based order, which I think isn't the agenda for the transatlantic community going forward. And I would just be interested if you have ideas of what are alternatives. I definitely understand the idea that we need to confront China, but I think that I'm not sure what the vision is for Europe and the United States in building something new, because I think the trading regime doesn't really have a lot of domestic political support on here, and probably not there either. So if you have other ideas of where should we be going as this Atlantic community?
I'm not as pessimistic as you may sound, but I see a lot of interaction and trade between European partners, American companies. I mean, also on artificial intelligence, a subject we have briefly touched here, but which is decisive also for our future of mankind. And I see that United States has the largest numbers of patents, but Germany is following on number 2, and there are a lot of cooperations already going on. And as I said, you have a very, very close partnership between European companies and United States federal states, like North Carolina, South Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, even Texas. And you can see that when German politicians now come to the United States, that they always try also to visit some of the states because they know what is at stake. And so you're right, it has become more difficult because what you see is more state intervention and more protectionism. But I don't think, when I look at history, you have always trends, and I think you have now more protectionism and state interventionism. 10 years from now, it could again look different. So what is essential is to keep our common bodies flowing, to keep the contact, to see that the transatlantic relation is essential, and you could see it also in the establishment of the Tech Trade Council that was established when the IRA dispute arose, and to actually bridge differences, and that is, I think, the way forward.
Let me. You go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. Right. So I would just comment on that quickly. So, this obviously has been a very difficult area. There have been a lot of attempts at European and American trade deals in the past that were not particularly successful. And with the TTC, the current agenda, I think mostly has been kind of, negatively focused as well, on things like export controls on China, for example, more barriers rather than advancing a positive agenda. One area I thought was very interesting that was a tentative positive agenda was the green steel negotiations between the United States and the European Union. Of course, that has not had a very happy end either. That negotiation has, dragged on and proved to be very difficult. But I think, initially there might have been some optimism about that. And, now it seems like that those negotiations got hung up on even determining, how do we even measure carbon in our two respective countries, right? But maybe there is some progress in that as well, however gradual. Just our countries starting to even figure out how they might measure carbon. So anyway, it's not a very positive picture, but that is one thing. And then, perhaps some coming together as a result of tensions like over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, more energy trade. But yeah.
Great. Thank you. My name is Bonnie Wachtel. I'm a professional investor. Picking up on the last question, this is for Mr. Klingst. It's very drawn to your framework of discussing history, trends, and inevitability. And in the circles in which I travel, there is no more compelling narrative than that of the deindustrialization of Germany based on the Ukraine war and the decisions that have been made about energy, because you cannot run a competitive economy if you don't have a competitive price of energy. As you look at inevitability, do you think that means a significant embrace of nuclear or a revision of the war on fossil fuels? And I am well aware you know much more about the situation than I do, so I may be wrong in any of my premises.
Well, on one point, you're right. I mean, the war is a heavy burden on Germany, especially on energy, and is a heavy burden on the German production side. But I would also agree that that Germany or German governments have done many mistakes in the past when it came to energy and the dependence on Russian gas and oil. But there's no deindustrialization going on, so that's a myth. I think that German industry is ailing, but when you look at the figures for next year, they look already much better. And I was actually thinking when the war broke out and the energy prices rose immensely, I thought that would be the end of many industries, and it didn't turn out to be that way. So thanks also to a lot of creative people, we managed to somehow bridge this huge difficulty. But we're not at the end of it. Then I would say when you look in life circles and history circles, you've seen things coming up, going away again, and coming up later again. And so I would say that Germany is taking tough lessons at the moment, and lessons that we need to take and that we were hesitant to take for a long, long time. We neglected certain things, but I think we will manage to come through.
Well, on that optimistic note, that's wonderful. It's good to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, this session is concluded. We reconvene momentarily back in the auditorium where Judge Ginsburg is going to lead our panel on regulating the digital economy. Would you please join me in thanking our three distinguished panelists?